Welcome, Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. It's really great to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Thanks. Now, you're somebody who I think of as a crossover person. You have such a fascinating background, having been brought up in Amish country, then going to seminary, then going to medical school with some training in Zen Buddhism. I'd like to know how that melange of influences prepared you to do what you're doing today.
Well, I could probably answer that at several levels. I think the deepest level for me has to do with, from a very early age, I was very confused about how you reconcile worldviews that are in many ways incompatible. For example, raised in a very conservative home without ready access to TV or radio, very suspicious about the world. We weren't outwardly Amish when I was young, but my parents left that area and community when I was 2 years old. And so I grew up without even a lot of times store-bought clothing. There's a lot of suspicion about the world. The way really conservative traditions work, including the Amish, is they leave the culture and believe that Christianity is preserved by living separately from all of that. And so that belief is really deep in the culture and the family I was raised in. But I was going to public school, and public school is a very different set of assumptions. You are taught science. You're taught that basically the implication is that these subjects are valuable and important in their own right, that all truth is God's truth in some ways, although it wasn't taught from a Christian perspective or a theological perspective, but there's thought to be value in world's knowledge. And that was completely incompatible with the worldview at home. So from a young age, I was trying to reconcile these worldviews. That's what drove me into interdisciplinary work in college and then into seminary to try to figure out how these worldviews coexist. Every worldview solves every problem from within that worldview. And so it's very difficult to find your way into a different worldview. And seminary was just a gift because I had these wonderful mentors, and it was all about how does theology coexist with philosophy and psychology, and what's the relationship between science and faith. Those were very meaningful questions for me to explore. And one of the brilliant things of Western culture is that if you have a medical problem, you go see the physician. If you have a psychological problem, you go see the psychotherapist. And if you have a spiritual problem, you go see a spiritual leader, whether it's an imam or minister or priest, etc. But the truth is, these are all coexisting in our lived lives. We bring these dimensions together all the time, and we need help, and we need to ask our experts to also step back and look at the bigger picture of how these factors come together in our lives. By having a chance to look at all of these different disciplines at a deep level, that was very helpful to me in terms of thinking, how do these disciplines coexist together? Historically, we separate them. Harvard, the running joke is that the only connection between all the different departments is the common heating plant between these departments. And so, right. It's, the world is becoming much more interdisciplinary. Millennials especially are much more interdisciplinary in their focus than people who have been in the university for decades. So the world is changing, but needs to change more.
Right. And so then you went to medical school.
Yes.
And it prepared you to think skeptically, to think scientifically. And then how did you get from there, briefly, to spontaneous remission, spontaneous healing, and the interest in this field?
In 2002, I had just graduated from residency. I was a new young faculty member at Harvard and a medical director at McLean. And an oncology nurse at Mass General in Boston came to me and asked for help explaining to her son that she'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I helped her explain this to her son, and that's a devastating conversation to have because pancreatic cancer is one of the really awful cancers to have. usually, almost always, you die from it. And it's a very brutal, short, painful ending. She then took off for a healing center and began writing me and calling me saying that she was seeing some amazing recoveries. She was getting better herself, and she hoped I would look into it. I said no, because I just assumed, wrongly, but I assumed that those stories could be explained through the typical explanations that we give in medicine, that this person's a really good chemotherapy responder, et cetera. Nikki was very persistent, and I owe her a large debt because of that. She began having people call me from around the country and elsewhere, saying they had amazing recoveries and did I want to see their medical evidence. And initially I said no. And I did review some of their stories. People were sending me their stories, sending me their medical files. And most of them I could explain with a bit of a reach, but still could explain from this within the standpoint of traditional medicine. Mm-hmm. But some of the stories I couldn't. And that's the long and short of it, is that in 2003, I did begin to look into these stories more deeply and try to figure out what was going on.
Right. And you used 3 criteria, I understand, for determining whether they were bona fide or not. What were those criteria?
Yes, I was very confused and I was skeptical. So I set up 3 criteria. Number 1, the person had to have a genuinely incurable illness, according to all that we currently understand. And number 2, they had to have medically indisputable evidence for accurate diagnosis and clear evidence for recovery. And number 3, there couldn't be any other good explanation for how they got better. In other words, there couldn't be an experimental medication or some way that could potentially explain their recovery. And I needed that because as I perused the research, that was itself confusing, because the research, although it historically is getting better over the decades, research into this area is not only complicated, it's also problematic in terms of the methodology. Usually the research has mixed up curable and incurable illnesses with each other. And I can understand why that would occur, because every illness is so different from every other illness. Even every type of cancer is so different from other types of cancer. Some cancers are fatal, no matter what you do. Some cancers are very responsive to chemotherapy. Some cancers you die with, but not from. Some cancers wax and wane. And so I can understand why so many illnesses would get lumped together, but to do so invalidates a lot of the research. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to keep it real clean. I had a lot of personal history in terms of my own questions from a very personal, deep level from childhood. How do you reconcile? How do you figure out what's true? I had read thousands of articles and books by that point in theology, philosophy of science, psychology, medicine, and looking for answers to put together an explanation of the world that made sense to me and also was healing. And so I had both a professional and personal investment in this pathway. So it was very important to me that I could manage this skepticism and find a path that would be true and not just be yet another theory that somebody was writing about.
And so as these cases began to pile up,
yes.
Was it disturbing for you? Were you conflicted about it? Did you feel kind of unequivocally pulled in that direction? How did you square that with your role as a doctor?
Well, I was confused for a while, and I grew up confused. And so that confusion continued for a while. This was kind of my empirical theology, because I wanted to figure out what was true. And I was tired of reading articles in all these different disciplines that in many ways were just theories. And when you begin to investigate this, it's still confusing, because most of the stories disappear when you look for evidence. That's just the nature of this work. Healers will report a lot of stories, but when you ask for evidence, they begin to disappear. There's a lot of emotion and pathos around this, because when you talk to people who are reporting these recoveries, there's a lot of hope that they're getting better too, and a lot of deep desire and longing that they're finding a path through this, and sometimes the evidence didn't support that. And so there's a lot of complicated sort of things that come together in this. That's why these three criteria were so important to me to begin distilling out what's true and what's not true.
Mhm. So when you say that there's nothing spontaneous about spontaneous remission, that's become one of your well-known sayings. What do you mean?
The word spontaneous in this context means without cause. And we are taught in medical school that spontaneous remission has no scientific value, that these are just flukes that occur out of the blue. If you are on the scientific side, you call these cases spontaneous remission. And again, you're taught that there's no medical value to this. If you are on the spiritual or religious side, you call these events miracles or spiritual healing. But I believe that all these terms are black boxes that have not been adequately investigated by a rigorous science. So that is how I ended up approaching all of this. Can you imagine a more unscientific attitude than just assuming that something has no cause? Spontaneous means no cause. I mean, everything has a cause. That's actually ridiculous. It's just that we haven't been asking the questions. We've had assumptions driving our perception of what's going on. And so that's one reason why there has been so little investigation into this area. It turns out that across all these illnesses, people are making very similar changes, and we're just not asking the questions. So yes, there's causes. We're assuming there was no cause. So
Right. I years ago, I spoke to a very well-known Christian mystic named the Daskalos, who was an extraordinary Cypriot Cypriot man in his 80s when I talked to him. And I was asking him about miracles, and he says there's no such thing as a miracle. He said if we understood how the universe works, we'd understand that they're not miracles.
yes,
we call them miracles because they're in the black box.
Yes, and that is such an important point. We need to change how it has historically been, how miracles has been defined in Webster's, for example, because miracles are not something that occurs supernaturally outside of natural laws. It's something that occurs outside of our understanding of natural laws. Yeah. And Daskalos makes a wonderful point. I would have loved to have met him. I've heard stories about him. Kyriakos Markides in Maine has written a lot about him, and Kyriakos is a wonderful friend and writes brilliantly about just the amazing individual that Daskalos has been over the decades.
Yeah, he was completely extraordinary.
Really was.
Amazing. I went to see him at town hall, and there were hundreds of crutches and all kinds of things that people who had healings were kind of strewn across the stage. And I couldn't understand a lot of what he said intellectually, but when I sat with him, I felt it. I mean, the power was unmistakable.
Yeah, boy. And he's in that Eastern tradition, which never became, in its best sense, never became as owned by a material understanding of theology. It really preserved this understanding that the invisible world is more real than the material world. And they've preserved something really essential, I think.
So when you talk in those terms, when you talk about the invisible world to medical colleagues, do you get pushback, or do they shake their heads and roll their eyes? Are they interested? What kind of reactions do you get?
It's complicated. I think that now you can say things in an academic or in a medical environment that you couldn't say even 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I think a physician or a researcher was more vulnerable to losing their career or suffering some kind of adverse effect of having such views. I think what has always been the case is, and increasingly is the case, is that people privately will come to me and talk about things that they believe, but they're more in the closet about it. Spirituality has become more acceptable, and academics and doctors feel much more open, much more able to be open about it than they did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and that sort of thing. That has been a big issue. But it is also true now that one can say these things and research these things in a way that you don't lose your career over.
That's what I was wondering.
Right.
So, I'm interested. You say that Western medicine is about looking for something outside to fix us. And yet you say we can't think ourselves into health.
Right.
So how do you thread that needle? How
Yeah.
does a person who's facing a fatal diagnosis work with that dichotomy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one way to talk about it is I really appreciate the efforts to talk about positive thinking and positive psychology and these efforts to be optimistic and courageous rather than fearful about the things that we face. I think it's also true, though, that if you try to have positive thoughts on a sea of unconscious fear or blame and shame kinds of ways of experiencing yourself in the world, that's not going to work. And I think it's also true that we all grow up with a complicated combination of true and false beliefs. We pick them up from our parents, we pick them up from kids on the playground, from teachers, from friends, from bosses, from partners. And some are true, some are false, some are conscious, some are unconscious. And I think what's true is if we have this complicated set of true and false beliefs, which we all do, we will have mixed results in our lives, our minds, and our bodies. And the people I study did a lot of work to begin healing some of these false beliefs and to begin becoming more aware of false beliefs that they didn't even know were guiding their lives. I think what's true is that as human beings, we're very poor at knowing our own true beliefs. One example of that is I grew up in a very conservative, fear-based religion of very extreme fundamentalism, and there is daily talk about faith and the importance of faith, but that faith was really fear. And I think faith that the universe is constructed in a way that you matter, that all people matter, and that the universe is friendly towards you, that's a really different set of beliefs than an unconscious or partially conscious set of beliefs that the world is against you and that you don't matter. And boy, these beliefs go deep, and they are partially conscious sometimes, and they can be completely unconscious. There's a lot of trauma in our world. There's a lot of people who've endured really difficult things, whether it's losses or abuse, lots of different kinds of trauma. And when these things happen, typically what happens is a person takes a belief that they're somehow not good enough, or that they're defective, or there's something bad or wrong with who they are. And that's true in terms of a belief that they have, and it can be very unconscious, and it can color how you see the world. A fish does not know what wet is if it doesn't know anything else. And so to become conscious that that's the construct with which you see the world through is a massive deal. One example I can give of that is when a person is diagnosed with a fatal illness like cancer, for example, and told that they have 12 months to live, it's shocking how frequently the response is fear, but also relief. Like, well, if I guess I've just got 12 months to live, I guess I don't have to go to business school like dad is making me, or I don't have to take over the family business. And that becomes sometimes such a release. It's like the death of a false self. And when that becomes associated with the birth of a more authentic self and the death of the false self, sometimes it's astonishing what then becomes possible for the person. Sometimes time begins to go by because there's something that's liberated for them. It's shocking how deep this stuff goes.
And it's complex.
It is very complex.
You talk about the 4 pillars of health, and that gets to what you were just saying. The immune system, immune response, stress response, nutrition, but then healing identity. And that seems to me what you're talking about here. How can a person who's facing a serious illness begin to heal their identity? What would that mean? What would you prescribe?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is whatever it takes to help a person become more aware of the beliefs that they have, that they're not good enough or that they're defective somehow. I think we often in the medical profession and in the helping professions like psychology and even in the spiritual professions, we too often teach people that the solution comes from outside of them, that they need an expert to help fix this, or they need a medication to fix this. I think that's a misunderstanding. I think that experts can be helpful. I think that medications can be helpful. I prescribe medications at times, but at a deeper level, we need to be genuinely helping a person experience what's right and great about who they are, helping a person treat themselves with love and compassion instead of judgment and condemnation. They need help seeing what's right about them. And that's, I think, a really big deal. I believe that our disciplines, psychology, theology, and medicine have historically been deficit-based. They're rooted in what's missing or wrong. Certainly the spiritual tradition I grew up in was about original sin and had very little understanding that we're all created in the image of God. Medicine is rooted in a disease model that looks for what's wrong and missing, but doesn't have a foundation built on helping people experience what's right and whole and complete in them. And psychology tends to historically reduce things to childhood deficits. And there's a place to understand that, but that's not the bigger story. Every person is the image of God, and there's nothing wrong with a person that can't be fixed with what's right about them. And therapy needs to not be just about rehashing the problems of the past or living in that dark cave of the past. The whole point is to have an experience where you can leave that dark cave of the past. And there's too much of therapy that historically has not done that. Psychiatry is very well known for reducing all kinds of human problems of living to neurochemical defects. So I think as the world is moving slowly but inexorably in the direction of models that are built on what's right and special about each individual human being, we are at the very beginning of an era that's going to be very exciting and allow people to heal in a way that has not been possible in the last number of decades.
When you say we are made in the image of God, what do you mean?
That's a big topic. That means that there's nothing wrong with us that cannot be fixed with what's right and great about us. Every person I've studied since 2003 has, in the end, been grateful for the illness that they had because it so fundamentally gave them a different experience of themselves and the world. And so they talk about this in different ways, but basically what they fundamentally say is that they begin to realize that they bring something special, something that's whole and complete into the world, and they begin to experience themselves as imperfectly perfect, and that's really a great thing. So I can tell you many, many stories about this, but one quick story is that a woman came to me. She described these years of childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse. She was raped multiple times. She ended up going into years of heroin and cocaine and just really painful stuff. Series of relationships that broke down and 2 divorces. And then she decided she was going to take her psychotherapy seriously and begin to take care of herself and treat herself like someone who mattered. As part of that, she joined a yoga group, and she was in yoga one day, and I think she said it was the child's pose, which I don't know a lot about, but she said she was in this child's pose, and all of a sudden it was like the curtains parted, and she realized that she wasn't this defective person that she had always thought she was. She realized that she was okay exactly as she is, that being perfectly imperfect is perfect for her, and that she really was okay. That was such a powerful experience for herself. And she then went out and took the next step, which was to integrate that new understanding into her life. And when I was sitting there talking to this woman, I was going, wow, because I asked her, this history that you're describing, the years of awful abuse, this is not who you are. I can tell you. I mean, she had this man sitting next to her who adored her. She'd been married for 10 years. He loved her, a very stable relationship. Her career had gone from success to success. She was settled. You could feel the peace in her. You could feel just how whole she was. And it was in the context of that when I asked, how is this? What happened given your history? That's how she explained this experience that she had that had so altered her experience of herself that she then went out and changed her life to match that. And that's when, shortly thereafter, she met a man who was able to be in a relationship with her that was so different from her prior relationships. She was able to hold down a job and then begin finding ways to be successful in her work in a way that she was promoted over and over. That's the kind of thing I've seen over and over and over again. And so although the details vary in every story, that's the underlying dynamic that has been life-changing for me to see and begin documenting.
Is that why they say that belief in God improves mental health outcomes? Is that the connection that you see?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that's complicated because if you believe that God is this judge that's going to get you if you don't keep looking over your shoulder, that's complicated. I think that's often why people say they're agnostic or atheist, because what they're often deeply spiritual individuals, but they're trying to escape or simply say, I know that at some level that if God does exist, he's not that. He's not this judge that's going to get me. So yes, qualified in that way, I agree with what you're saying.
Right. You say in one of the interviews that I read that the body is a metaphor for lessons the deeper mind is trying to learn.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, that simple statement reflects a path that I began to believe in the context of this research, but it turns upside down what I was taught in medical school and in psychiatric residency and also in seminary, which is shocking to say, perhaps. At least the way I interpreted the teachings and the readings that I did during all those years in seminary and all of the searching for years that I've done theologically and spiritually. In the West, we do tend to believe that the body is who we really are, that's the primary datum. We are our physical bodies first. That made it very confusing to me what the soul is for decades. I would read these definitions of the soul that just seemed to vary from theologian to theologian, and they just seemed like this. I couldn't get my head around what they were talking about. But when I listened to these stories for enough years and began to realize that sometimes they were telling me stories where they would have a deep experience that then would result in a physiological change, I began to see all of this differently. So I could tell you about an experience I had personally about this, or I could tell you many clinical stories. Let me tell you one story that I tell about in Cured. I don't tell this piece of the story because I wasn't sure how readers would respond, but she said I could write about it in the book and also I could tell it. And this is a very provocative story that shows the possibilities of this way of thinking. And I'm not saying you can reduce everything to this way of thinking, because we're talking about something that's very big and complicated. Yeah. So in Cured, I talk about this woman named Juniper who was diagnosed in her mid-20s with an incurable illness called ankylosing spondylitis. Ankylosing spondylitis is a terrible illness and is associated with a lot of pain. What happens is that the calcifications begin in your pelvis and creep up the spine and basically turn you into an immovable block of cement, unable to move. You can't twist your spine, you can't turn, you can't, eventually you can't expand your rib cage when you breathe, and all of these movements that we take for granted all through the day depend on the ability of our spine and our bones to move and expand and contract and twist and turn. And that's what ankylosing spondylitis takes away from you. When she was diagnosed in her mid-20s, after a 2-year search for the right diagnosis, she told her doctor that she accepted the prognosis, or she accepted the diagnosis, but refused to accept the prognosis. She was in love with her husband. She wanted to have children. She was not ready to consign herself to living immobilized in a wheelchair. as part of that, she joined yoga, and she went on this whole search around changing her nutrition and changing her life at every level. And yoga became a very important pathway for her, but she also says it's not really about the yoga. It's about how all of the work she did changed her experience of herself in the world. And she doesn't know which piece of this was definitive for her healing, but she says one of the three things that happened was associated with a lot of emotion. And she was doing some energy work one day, and as this person was working with her, she had this powerful memory that came back and was associated with the release of a lot of emotion. And that's, as a psychiatrist, what you look for. You look for what's associated with a lot of affect or emotion, because that's a sign for something important for the person. She went back to this memory when she was approximately 12 years old, and they were together in her with her extended family for Thanksgiving. And she came from a very loving family, very loving family in many ways. Her cousin, who was about her age, walked through the room, and a relative said, "Your cousin is way too young to be swinging her hips that way. I hope you're going to be a good girl," or implied that part at least. And Juniper was just a young girl, wanted to be a good girl, wanted to, as we all do, want to do the right thing with her life and be acceptable and all of that. And she said that experience during coming back to her during this session was associated with a lot of emotion, a cathartic sort of experience. And she wonders if that was a very important part of her healing. And looking back on it, that's very provocative, right? And she said something to the effect that it makes sense to consider that the illness that she suffered from began in her pelvis, and certainly a big part of her liberation has been about becoming comfortable with herself and her body, and with who she is as a person and as a woman, and with sexuality and with openness, and not having to please others, what it means to live an authentic life where one can have their feelings and celebrate them and enjoy their feelings, and not feel like you have to be compliant with everyone else or live within confines of what's quote unquote acceptable. That pattern I see over and over and over again. And so, but the implications for that are really profound. If a person can have a cathartic emotional or spiritual experience, and then your body changes to keep up with this new self-understanding, that's wild. And that's especially hard for those of us who live in the West to understand, where we're trained to see reality through a very material lens, as if the physical body is the primary datum for who we are. I just simply don't believe that's true anymore. So,
and it's interesting too that she was warned against moving her hips,
right? Exactly.
Like a loose woman, and she developed this condition where she froze.
Right, and I've seen this kind of thing over and over again, and I think we have to qualify that in one sense and say that we are both biological beings and spiritual beings. We are of a dual nature, and you cannot reduce one to the other. And so you have to give full play to the fact that we are biological beings and to the fact that we are spiritual beings. Ernest Becker, in Denial of Death, said that we are all gods and goddesses with anuses. And so that's his way of capturing this irreducible dual nature that we have. So I think it's important that we don't reduce either our biology or our spirituality to each other, and we need to let them stand on their own ground and be understood within the terms of what they really are.
Right.
So we're talking about something very complicated. I just simply believe that that's hard for the Western mind to understand, because the mind and this deeper soul, the deeper self, are really powerful. Our beliefs are very powerful. And when we have an experience at a deep level, it can affect our biology in really important ways.
You're talking about a duality, but it's an interpenetrating duality, isn't it?
Yes.
There's a porousness between mind and body, between body and spirit.
Yes. that's a really important point, because we've been taught historically that there is no relationship, and that's changing. Stair steps are being built between mind and body every day now, and that is being revised at unconscious and conscious levels in our culture. But historically, that chasm has been very deep, right, because of the Cartesian and Newtonian assumptions that we have been taught to view reality through.
Can you say something about the three brains? These are big questions, I understand, but the three brains and keeping the three brains in balance, what does that have to do with setting ourselves up for healing and for remission if we're ill?
Yeah, good point. So I am very susceptible to being a traditional Westerner where I'm cut off below the neck. But the truth is, we're not just heads out there. We're not just these cerebral beings. We also do have these brains in our hearts and in our guts that are vitally important. We have millions of neurons that innervate the heart and have this reciprocating kinetic back and forth relationship between our cognitive brains and our hearts, and between our guts and our cerebral brains. And so you're right, we do have three brains. 90% of the serotonin, the antidepressant molecule, is created in our guts, for example. And so if you want to take care of your mood and your depression, it's really important to take care of your microbiome, to take care of the terrain of our guts. That's a big deal and often under acknowledged in our current paradigms.
Yeah. So we need to have those in balance when we're looking at trying to moving toward healing.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. I'm interested in what you say about burning our boats. To attain the life you want, especially while ill, you have to identify any boats you have waiting in the harbor and burn them down for good.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So historically, there's been this famous war story that's told that this small army needed to take the island against the army they were fighting against. The army they were fighting against was much larger, a number of sizes larger than they were, and yet it was vital that they take this island. So what the commander did was, their ships sailed into harbor, they disembarked, and then he told them to burn their boats. That changed the psychology in a critical way, because as long as you know that with your addiction or your self-destructive patterns, if you know that you can go back to that pattern when the stress gets high, there's always a possibility of going back to that. When you take away that option, that changes the psychology fundamentally. And it's certainly true that some of the people that I've studied have talked about how important it was that they closed that door forever to going back to that self-destructive pattern. For example, when I'm talking to a patient, it's very common that you can feel that they've left a door cracked in the back of their brain, that when the stress gets, even though they'll say, you know, I want to stop this stuff that's ruining my body because of the diabetes, I want to stop the alcohol, I want to stop whatever the self-destructive pattern is, you can feel that even though they might not be aware of it, you can feel the door that's cracked in the back of their brain, that if the stress gets high, they'll think, well, I'm just going to have that quart of ice cream, or I'm going to have just one beer and I'll be good. Unfortunately, their brain is playing a trick on them, and they go right back to the self-destructive behavior. And then a month from then, they're in real tough shape medically. So I can feel, after having done this work as a physician for many years, I can feel when someone closes that door and throws away the key. You can feel something shift in a way that sometimes that shift is so profound, they're not even interested in that behavior anymore. Other times they do go through this wilderness experience where they long for it, but they begin to experience the emptiness in a way they can begin feeling that emptiness was something real instead of the alcohol or the ice cream, for example. And and if they can fill that hole in the soul with something real that's more nourishing, a truer experience of their value as a human being, for example, realizing that they're not defective, or having deeper, truer relationships that nourish them instead of are conflict ridden. And so those kinds of things begin to fill that hole in the soul with something real in a way they don't need the substance in quite the same way. So you can feel when somebody burns that boat and they're ready to move on to the next chapter. Now, I should place a caveat around this, though, because it's also complicated. Sometimes people just simply need to go through a period of time where they do feel loved and cared for, even while they are using the substance that's self-destructive. And sometimes they do need to just have enough time to experience that the substance can begin to lose its hold on them that way. So some people need to just burn their boat, experience the emptiness of that, and know that they can't go back to that because they'll lose everything that they long for, whether it's their health or their partner who's just done with this and is going to leave them if they don't change this now.
Right.
So different people, some people need to burn their boats. Some people just simply need to learn a path that's less shame and blame and just simply more compassionate, so that they can begin to let go of the self-destructive behavior and then eventually burn the boat.
When you're working with somebody who's just gotten a fatal diagnosis, a serious diagnosis, do you warn them to expect a time in the wilderness, a time when when they're having to go, they're going to have to go through a dark night of the soul,
Yes.
through the forest? They're going to have to stop in the middle of the forest and not know where they are. Is that something that you prepare people for?
All the time, because I believe that is part of the trajectory of this, is that you have to let go of the past. You have to let go of the false self. And that's a death. And I'll tell you, those deaths are not easy for any of us. Sometimes it's the letting go of a relationship that's not right for you, or a career that's not right for us. These are complicated, messy situations, and people just need a lot of support, because the death of the false self is not a simple thing. It is painful.
Right.
And it is a wilderness experience. You have to go through the wilderness for a while before you can experience the rewards of a more authentic self and life.
It seems to me that as a culture on the planet, we're going through a wilderness experience, but with the pandemic, people really not knowing what to do with this information, and how to use it to change their lives. What kind of advice would you give somebody who is feeling betwixt and between because of this illness?
That is such a great question. I think that is exactly what's going on. This COVID is kind of a bullshit exposer in some ways. It shows the ways of thinking that we've had that are not complete or very sufficient for putting together a life. I think that we are in a big transition as human beings. We are realizing that a lot of our institutions that we've trusted for eons are not completely trustworthy, whether we're talking about government institutions or scientific institutions. And I think I would like to see a deeper conversation as a culture around these things, because whether you're Republican or Democrat, there's partial truths on both sides. And we need a deeper conversation that helps us see the partial truths and the falsifications that are occurring on both sides, so that we can start to see the deeper picture. Because it's true, we are losing trust in some of our institutions, and we don't have good replacements for that right now. So who do you trust? That's a real issue, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And it might be in terms of which authorities you do trust or not trust might differ on different sides of that equation, but it's still the same basic issue. And it's a very positive step that we are letting go of these deficit-based institutions. But this is a wilderness time, and we have not developed such a solid sense of the value of each human being and of what's right and complete about each individual human being, how special each person is, since we don't have a deep enough experience of that yet, we're struggling. And we are in a wilderness time where we don't have good replacements, and our institutions have not changed to be built on what's right about each individual yet. So this is a wilderness time.
A couple more questions. How do you work with fear, with people who are just terrified? I know many people who are just stricken with fear over the pandemic. Suddenly, the world has become an unsafe place, as if it wasn't always. But how do you, as a psychiatrist, deal with extreme fear? What would you recommend for people?
That's so important. And I think that the only real solution to that is to help a person experience themselves as someone who matters, to experience other people as people who matter. And so all of these different things that are going on in our culture right now, whether it's around race, around histories of abuse, as these things become more in the present conversation as they come out of the closet, this is a fabulous thing, because these things for centuries have been buried in the closet of our psyches and in the closet of our culture. It's progress, these things are coming out, but we need to help each person experience their value and to build a life on what's right and special about themselves, and see themselves and others through that kind of lens.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot of work to do there, but it's starting to happen.
Yeah. And what role does accepting mortality play in healing and spontaneous remission? These folks who go into the wilderness, don't they have to accept their impermanence before anything can shift?
Yeah, that's right. And we have a real fear of death, I think, as a culture. Western culture is known for being afraid of death. Ernest Becker wrote a book called Denial of Death and said that's what Western culture is. It's built around the denial of death. New York Times had an article over the weekend about death and how now it's this new diagnosis, this new category in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. So a psychiatrist now can bill for services around pathological grief. And so now grief in this sense is thought to be okay if it lasts for 1 year, but after that it's considered a pathology. That's not how other cultures historically have understood death. I think what's true is that when we face death, that's really about the death of the false self. And so when we all die at some point, whether we recover from an incurable illness or not, we're still going to die at some point. Many of the people that I study, they faced their illness, expected to die. That giving up and realizing, well, if I only have 12 months to live, then I'm going to try to live with as much well-being and love as I can, and I'm not going to live my life trying to please everyone else. That death of the false self can in some cases be powerful enough that you give birth to a more authentic self, and then sometimes time begins to go by, and that becomes the possibility of not needing to die physically yet sometimes, which is an astonishing thing.
It is an amazing thing. I remember a story Stephen Levine used to tell about a guy who went to his doctor and he was given something 3 months to live or something. And he said, well, I need to go home and just plant my garden. And he went home, he planted his garden. 10 years later, he walked back into the doctor's office. Said, what's been going on? He said, I've been gardening a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
He got in touch with things that were fundamentally healing for him.
Yeah.
And we all benefit from that kind of effort, whether it's nature or getting back in touch with our roots of who we are.
Yeah. Just one last thing. You said something so beautiful. You say something in us seems to benefit from experiencing that which is perfect, whole, and complete within us.
Yeah.
What's the connection between that and the kind of equanimity that becomes a foundation for healing?
Yeah, I think what's true is we all bring something of such magnificence and wholeness into the world, and we don't need an expert to fix us. And I'm not saying there's not value in that, but fundamentally, to begin to experience what's right and good about each one of us and what's special, and to see and experience ourselves with compassion rather than judgment, and to build a life on that, that's a really big deal. Gabor Mate is a friend who talks brilliantly about how if we don't know how to say no to pleasing others, our body will eventually say no for us. I believe our medical hospitals and clinics and our psychiatric hospitals are full of people who we've not helped learn how to say no. And we have to learn how to say no before we can learn what to say yes to about the dignity of who we are. So I think this is very much a crux around much of the lifestyle illnesses, the 80 to 90% of illnesses that people suffer from, whether it's the heart disease, the diabetes, the lung disease, the autoimmune illness, many of the cancers. These have deep lifestyle roots, but we treat them as incurable and we throw medications at them instead of helping a person realize, what's the message of this illness? What is my body saying to me? Why is my body saying no? Where am I not saying no in my life? Where am I trying to please others instead of live my life authentically? Those are really big issues.
Huge issues. I just thank you very much. It's really been wonderful talking to you. Your work is so inspiring, and I can't wait to read your next book. Do you have any sense of when that might happen?
I've started writing it. We'll see how long it takes.
Good luck.
It's a lot of work.
Good luck with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark, very much.
Ciao.